Friends and family, here at Dadages, we believe two guests are better than one. So that's what we have for you today. Stick around for a doubly great episode of Dadages. That's right, Dadages, friends and family. As part of our continuing conversation around diversity here in February, which is Black History Month in the United States, we bring you not one, but two wonderful guests from the Dadages virtual studio. And what I love about today's episode is that you're going to see that these two wonderful women joining me in studio today share some very interesting common elements in their background. But they've never actually met one another until today. We're excited to make the connection today, and we are excited to bring them together with all of you. Our guests today are Maya Washington and Tirana Harris. Maya is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, and you can add to the title of filmmaker the following titles: writer, director, producer, actor, poet, photographer, and educator in the arts. Maya has devoted her career to what she describes as social impact stories that illuminate aspects of the human experience that are untold or rarely seen, or that might benefit from new approaches to issues of diversity and inclusion. One of Maya's most recognized works is the book and corresponding documentary film, Through the Banks of the Red Cedar, which chronicles the life of her father, Gene Washington, who was at the center of desegregation of college football and changing the composition and diversity of the NFL. Tirana is the owner of Capacity Media, which is an emerging production company developing both scripted and unscripted projects. She's been part of Emmy and Peabody award-winning teams at ABC. With over 20 years of experience, her work has appeared on Good Morning America, Nightline, World News, The Oprah Winfrey Show, and others. Tirana's work within her production company includes a docuseries based on the career of her father, Cleveland Chick Harris, who is a pioneer in bringing Black coaches to the sidelines and to the forefront of NFL coaching ranks through a 33-year-long career as an NFL coach, spanning 1981 to 2013. And Tirana is also a classmate of mine from Stanford and a friend for nearly 30 years. I'm sure everyone can see why we are so excited here at Dadages to be bringing the two of you together today, Maya and Tirana. Welcome to Dadages.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. That couldn't have been a better welcome. You're not only a good producer, but a good host, it turns out. Talent.
Thank you.
Lots of talent, Chad.
Maya, great to have you, and great to meet you for the first time today as well.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I'm so excited about this conversation.
Yeah, we are as well. So excited to bring both of you to the Dadages friends and family. And ladies, you are both amazing storytellers. So I'd like to start there. I'd love to sit back and listen and give each of you just a few minutes to share the stories of your fathers and their legacy for the members of the Dadages friends and family who might not be as familiar with their history. Maya, why don't you start by giving a bit of the background regarding your father, Gene?
Sure. My dad had a career before I was born. So most of his amazing contributions to college football, college track and field, and then later the NFL all happened before I was born. And so in 2011, one of his teammates, Bubba Smith, passed away. And people who remember the Police Academy movies, you remember Bubba Smith as the Hightower character.
Officer Hightower.
For me,
yeah.
I am Officer Hightower. For me, I was just not a football person. I'm an artist, and that's kind of where my interests were. And my dad was successful in business after he finished his football career. So this was an aspect of his life I didn't know about. And so it wasn't until his teammate passed away and me being around my dad's teammates and hearing all of these amazing stories about the desegregation of college football that they may have not realized were so significant because they were just 20-somethings living their life, being named national champions and stuff like that, but not thinking about the historical significance of their teams. And my dad later, after his time at Michigan State University, where he was recruited, and among the to our knowledge, the team that had the most representation historically that we are referring to as the first fully integrated college football team in America. So my dad was on a team that won back-to-back national titles. He went on to the NFL, was a first-round pick for the Minnesota Vikings, and he and 3 of his teammates at Michigan State were drafted in the first round within the top 8 picks. So he did all of these amazing, groundbreaking things before I was born, and it was the loss of his teammate that really sparked this for me, because the special and unique thing about Bubba Smith, in addition to being hilarious in the Police Academy movies and being this powerhouse football player, he was the reason my dad got to Michigan State. He and his father recommended my dad for a scholarship to Michigan State, and had that opportunity and that door not open for him, I don't know that we would be having this conversation right now, because that small seed changed everything for my dad. And obviously that trickled down to me and my siblings. So quite a story, quite a heritage, and quite a contribution that I became obsessed with and started to uncover back in 2011 and continue to explore all the time, every day.
Truly an amazing story, and you've given us a lot to dive into there, and we will as we move along. But first, Tirana, I'd love to hear your narrative of the legacy and the story of Chick Harris.
I think our dads lived some parallel lives. I think while your dad was burning it up on the field, my dad was probably starting his coaching career as one of a handful of Black coaches in college football. My dad did play. Thankfully, he had wonderful mentors at Northern Arizona University who said, you know what, you're a good teacher. You should be a good coach. And that's really where we see the first waves of Black coaches coming into the NFL from these programs where they were given opportunity. Very simple. And I think I became obsessed with my dad's story. As a journalist, you pay attention to headlines, and then you pay attention to whose story is being told and from the POV it's being told. And so at some point during my career at ABC News, I stopped and I said, all these headlines every year about how there's no Black coaches. I know a lot of Black coaches, and that bothered me. And so about in 2011, actually, ironically, I started to become obsessed about piecing their history together. Football was a huge part of my life. I always say our lives revolved around the rhythm of football. And so it gave me so much, the game of football. And I think these men gave the game so much. And that's what really fueled me to go tell their stories, because I want young people to understand that there's a place for you no matter what you look like. And I think their stories really inspire that. So my dad, to your point, got into the NFL in 1981. There were like 15 coaches of color out of a league of like 300. Those men went on to be the first Black coordinators of the NFL. Those men went on to be the first Black coaches of the NFL. So those are his buddies. I just really wanted to record their stories before they passed away. Simply, let's record that oral history. So that's what I've spent the last 4 years really doing independently, believing that there is a market for their stories in this world of sports documentaries, and believing that in order to continue to push forward and to make more equity in sports, we need to know where we've been. The past is present. So I'll stop there so we can discuss. But I would love to say, Maya, that one of our participants is Jimmy Ray. And Jimmy Ray was an amazing MSU graduate. Jimmy Ray was a mentor, example for my father, getting into the league in the 70s as a coach. So MSU and the things he did by being the first Black quarterback to lead a team to an essential national championship in 1966 was an amazing milestone in this journey we are all still taking in terms of Black leadership in sport.
It's amazing. Great stories. It's great to see the common ground. And I want to focus on maybe one of the key differences between your two stories and explore it a little bit. And I think it was influential in the way each of you have thought about and the way you've communicated about your father's experiences. Tirana, it seems that you've kind of, as you said, lived your life around the rhythm of football, and that's been a real integral part of your life. Whereas Maya, your experience with your father was really after his playing days. And this has been a moment of reflection for you and learning through this journey you've been on with your dad and going back and looking at things that happened before your time. I was really fascinated by that element. And let's spend some time talking about that. Tirana, maybe you can start and just sort of talk about what is the rhythm of football? What is that like to live that life as a coach's daughter?
Yeah, well, my dad almost missed my birth because he was in Southern California. He was in the University of Washington at the time. This was in the 70s, so very early for Black coaches to be at D1 schools. And my mom tells a story of calling him, and he somehow left a star recruit and came to, be present for my birth before my mom drove herself to the hospital. But I tell that story because the beautiful thing is I always say my dad chose me that day.
You were,
and there were times.
You were the star recruit that day.
I was the star recruit that day. And that was really important for me because there were times in life when dad couldn't be there. But that day, my birthday, which was just last week, he was there. In fact, he got the star recruit because the parents said, we want our son to go to a school where the dad cares about his family. And if you take care of your family, take care of our son the way you take care of your family, you got us. I think he was like competing against USC, which makes me so happy that he beat USC in that particular recruit. But the point is, after college football, they always say in the NFL, like you are packed. I mean, you have like 2 months off. And that's it. It's year round. But we loved it. It was a privilege. And we just didn't get to see him very much. But it taught me so many lessons, which I'm sure we'll get into. To this day, I find much comfort in just watching a game with my family because of how we grew up watching football.
That's an amazing story. And I love the family values component and how that allowed him to get that star recruit, the second star recruit of the day, and steal them from USC. Fantastic. So Maya, from your perspective, as we mentioned earlier, you really lived your father's football life in arrears. You looked at it through the rearview mirror along with him. And that must have been a very different experience than what Tirana is describing. Maybe you can share what your experience was in going through that revisiting experience with your dad.
Yeah, it was. And I think the stories that Tirana shared resonate because I have older sisters. I was a surprise baby. So my sisters were little girls. A lot of the great stories that I uncovered also had some of those kind of shadow moments where my dad wasn't always able to be with the family in life, kind of revolving around the football season. And there's just so many things that for my mom, my parents, if you can imagine, they married at 21 and 22 years old, I believe they were. So for all of these things to happen in 67, for my dad to be drafted, them to get married, both were raised in the segregated South. My mother did her college years in Northern California, my dad in Michigan. So the culture shock of going to Minnesota. And this was a time where teams stayed year round. There wasn't the off-season snowbird thing that happens with teams now. These were people who actually stayed and lived in the community year round. And so it has been really humbling. And in the process of making this film and later the book and getting to know a lot of NFL families and college football families and just seeing the extent to which this game takes up every corner of your life and it becomes sort of the center of the universe because life revolves around that football season and what happens during tournament season or bowl season and playoffs and things like that. And so as a producer of the documentary and understanding kind of the cadence of the past few years and when you can get interviews and when you can't and when you need to kind of give people a little time to get back to you. I've gotten to know that rhythm of college and professional football. And for me, I can only know the life that I had. And I'm grateful for the life that I did have. And in getting to do this project with my dad and involve my family members, I feel like I got a taste. I got a taste of what that lifestyle is and have a lot of appreciation for the ways that, for the most part, growing up, I had a lot of anonymity, opportunities to just sort of do my own thing. Occasionally, people would recognize my father, or for people who were diehard Vikings fans, especially those of that Purple People Eater era, people would stop us and say hi and stuff like that. But I have a lot of, I don't know how to say it, compassion isn't quite the right word, but the football families these folks are like built Ford tough, like it is not an easy life, even though from today's lens, it would be like, oh, that is not a hard life. But if you can imagine our fathers coming of age in the late 60s, early 70s, and for Tirana's family, the early 80s, this NFL side of the career starts. It was a different time. My dad's generation helped fight for the salaries that exist today, the opportunities that exist today. So it wasn't quite how it is today.
Yeah, definitely a different time. But, I can even relate in today's day and age to the notion of privilege, but at the same time, struggle and sacrifice that exists around sports and particularly around football. And in our family, the athletes aren't in the previous generation, they're in the next generation because I'm a football dad. And I can tell you that rhythm of football, the narratives that you're sharing, Maya, that common theme you found from all these people who have lived a football life during your production of the documentary, I can tell you that it starts very early. And here at Dadages, we spend a lot of time talking about generations and how each generation benefits from the transfer of knowledge and wisdom and experience from past generations through parents and mentors. In the case of each of your fathers, rewinding all the way back to their youths, and the experience that I'm talking about now, being a football dad and seeing what my boys go through, it seems like it took a lot of hard work and support from family and coaches and from others within the community for your fathers to go on and do what they did, to have that privilege of being able to play sports. It wasn't just a given, and it became a vehicle for changing their lives. And so, kind of under this banner of it takes a village, Maya, in your book, you talk about the community of elders that were there to support your father and others. And in particular, you mentioned a bit ago, Coach Willie Ray Smith Sr., Bubba Smith's dad, and the role that he played in your father's football journey and ultimately in shaping his entire life. Can you share a little bit more on some of these wonderful stories of community support that it took to help your father get where he arrived?
Absolutely. And it's exciting, that we are in the midst of Black History Month, because I think my dad's story and the life that my parents lived in Texas coming of age in the 50s and 60s, America was segregated. And so that meant separate schools, separate restrooms, separate public access to things that we take for granted, like libraries and even your own high school. So my dad was not able to go to the high school in his own community because he was Black, and there was no high school for Black students. So he was actually bused to a school for colored high school students, and that's the language they used in those days. He was bused to this other school, George Washington Carver in Baytown, where my mother lived. And so they've known each other since ninth grade. The way my mom tells it, they were friends. The way my dad tells it, they were sweethearts. And, there was one good thing about segregation is sort of his punchline. But what was really significant about that time, as oppressive as it was to live in an environment that restricted everything that you did, where you could go, where you could shop, how early you needed to get home at night, what jobs you could apply for, what colleges you could attend. There was this amazing wealth of community that existed. Oftentimes in the context of a religious community, at a church, extended families. People had big families in those days. So 8 kids, 6 kids, and all of those kids end up having kids and living in the same community. So the thing that my parents really speak so highly of are those teachers, those coaches, those people in the community who, if someone didn't have the money for the cheerleading uniform or the band instrument, the community would come together and make sure that that child would have what they needed to be successful. And so my dad encountered the Smith family, so Bubba Smith and his father, Willie Ray Smith Sr., in Beaumont, Texas. So this is about 100 miles away. And it's one of the stories that just still takes my breath away, that they played against each other in the All Black Leagues, because it wasn't like today where you see everybody on the field. You could only compete against other African American schools. And my dad and Bubba crossed paths playing basketball, football. My dad played baseball and ran track and other sports. And when Coach Duffy Doherty, who was starting this recruitment pipeline from the South, kind of using segregation to his advantage, knowing that those public schools in the state of Texas and other parts of the South were not going to give access to African-American students or African-American players. And he had a relationship with Bubba Smith's father, and the Smiths said, you're recruiting my son, but you should take a look at this other kid 100 miles away. His name is Eugene Washington. I think he'd be great. And really on the word of the Smith family, Duffy Doherty sent a coach down, did a recruitment visit with my father and his family. They'd never had a white person in their home on a social visit before. Both my grandmother and grandfather were sort of in the service industry. So when they encountered their white neighbors, it was usually in an employment situation. So this was pretty unheard of to have this coach come into my grandparents' home, recruit my father, and do that based on the word of Bubba Smith and Coach Willie Ray Smith. We didn't have the highlight reels and all the, crazy competitive stuff that people do to get their kids to a D1 school. And for that to take place, to me, really speaks of what that Black community was like during Jim Crow. And I do not know that in 2024, as parents are preparing their kids, they're seniors right now, to find that opportunity. I can't imagine while a school is recruiting your kid that you're going to go, oh, well, yeah, take our kid, but there's this other kid. It was a different time. And that opportunity really changed everything for my dad. And I think there's so much that we can take from that beauty of community and that desire to see everyone win that my dad really benefited from, thanks to the Smith family.
It's amazing to think of such a strong community extending 100 miles across rural Texas to make a connection like that happen. And thank God that coach was smart enough to listen, right? And Tirana, it's clear that your father also had a community and tremendous family support during the time he was coming up. And I know he particularly credits his grandmother, who played an important role in raising him. Can you help us understand the village your father had growing up?
Sure. I mean, my dad was raised by a single mother, a domestic in North Carolina, in Durham, North Carolina. He grew up right down the street from North Carolina Central, one of the great HBCUs. And that's where he saw people who looked like him playing this game. And so let's never doubt the power of an HBCU, because at the time on television, he was watching segregated teams. My dad grew up watching the Washington team, I'll say, and there were no Black players and there were no Black coaches, of course, back in the day. So when my dad said it intrigued him and he thought it was easy just to get 10 yards and a first down, he was watching that at an HBCU, seeing people who look like him playing the game. So that was my dad's community. He grew up in the back of the bus. For him, it changed when he went to California. I went to Long Beach Poly High School, which is an amazing school and story of the amazing athletes that came out of there, including Billie Jean King. And he just had this village of women, really, which I love that story. Single mom, a grandmother, a great aunt who believed in him and set him straight. And because of that discipline he was raised with, he was able to thrive in football. So he was not raised in the military, but he was raised by women, I like to say, who taught him to do hard work. And I think that's a really important part, because women have always had a hand in football. I think it's a real popular topic right now, but the women who held these men down were serious and they wanted them to thrive in whatever it was. At the time, sports was a great avenue, as it is still today for Black families. And so they were taught that they could be just as good. And surely that showed on the field. And so that community was important, but the community of people of all colors was important when they got into college and their talent rose to the top and they had allies who said, I see you and you can go far. For my dad, that was not only his coach at Northern Arizona University, who got him into a graduate assistant job and sent him on his way to D1 college. And it was Chuck Knox, who said, you come stand by me on national television every Sunday, and I'm going to show the world that you know what you're doing. So there's beautiful stories like that throughout sports. And that's why I love sports. It's a family in and of itself. And I'm so excited for your son and for you, Chad, quite frankly, to be embraced by that, because there's something where all of our boundaries fall away when we're watching a game. And quite frankly, that's why I fell in love with football and the community. I'm a biracial kid. I grew up with a Black dad and a white mom in a time when that was not popular in Seattle, Washington. And our family was football. It was seeing a great number of Black Americans and white Americans come together every day to make this business and this game. I was on a little island all by myself. Sure, there were not Black head coaches at that time in the early 80s, but my dad we were loved, we were embraced. And that's the power of sports and doing something together, that community. Back to the women for a minute, I have to say, in doing my documentary, that's one of the most beautiful things that I've encountered are these stories of the women who sacrificed so much to keep their families on track so their husbands and their partners could do their dream. And they're silent partners, a lot of this, but they love football. They're just as competitive, I assure you. So these communities are really important, and they were the pride of their communities. And that's what made me so sad to see that their stories are not being given the due that they're given, because it took the community to uplift them, Black and white. And then for us to have so many amazing things happening in sports right now, we have a record number of coaches of color in the NFL right now. And to think that we are not commemorating the stories that got us there, that's where I can use my craft every day to dig in and figure out how do we get here so we don't do it again.
Yes, amazing that both of you are using your platforms to tell these stories. And I'm really happy and proud to be a small part of that as well, and bringing these messages and background and the untold stories of the communities and of these groups of women and everyone that you're sharing who don't make it to the headlines, and they're not on the front page, and they're not in any of the social media posts when it comes to game day, but they're all there in the background making all of this possible. And I want to focus on another element, which has to do not necessarily with people, but with place. Obviously, we've talked about how both of your fathers grew up in the segregated Deep South. Tirana, your father coming from Durham, North Carolina, and Maya, your father coming from rural Texas. In the case of Chick Harris, making a transition to California and then ultimately to Arizona. And in the case of Gene Washington, making the transition to Michigan State. Obviously, those were dynamic cultural and geographical shifts for them at the time, and probably unheard of for people in that generation, people of any race, that people weren't that mobile in life. And to make a dramatic change like that in your life was a lot to consider at that time. And they had to have seen very stark cultural differences as they made these transitions. Tirana, perhaps you can share a little bit about your father's journey and some of those cultural differences that he experienced as he was transitioning from the Deep South to California.
Sure. Well, my dad is kind of just a citizen of the world. He loves people. We really didn't talk a lot in the house about him being one of the only Black coaches on staffs or one of two Black coaches on staff. Like that wasn't a conversation. We just saw it. I didn't realize until I was a journalist how significant that was, and a woman walking through professional spaces that were predominantly white in network news, how significant what he had done was in the 80s. I mean, you look at video of draft days in the NFL in the 1980s, those rooms are white. And I don't say that to be harsh, but the fact that then you were trying to create a career at a same time when Black players were sometimes not staying in the same hotel rooms, quite frankly. That's really interesting. And that irrespective of race, what you must have to have inside of you to believe in yourself comes from a place that is really, really deep. And my dad instilled that in me in turn, but his experiences, and he loved the game so much. You know, my dad did not harp on being, and he was given a lot of opportunity because of his talent. So my dad did not harp on being the only ever. It was really me just observing, hard work was just what this generation did. He was the first in our family to go to college. So you weren't looking back. You were going to figure it out. And it was just that scrappiness that made these men special and opened these doors for this present generation. I'm getting lost a little bit in my thought pattern there, but I think that because of where they came from, they had compassion for all their players, white or Black, their teammates. And that's also what made them great and what made the NFL great, is because of the things they had been through, they knew how to love people and to want the best for them in the game.
Amazing brotherhood and amazing community at that level, for sure. And, Maya, you talked a bit about the Michigan State coaching staff really learning to leverage and take advantage of the segregation of the South and creating what became known as the Underground Railroad for college athletics. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and maybe share some of the stories that were defining for your father along the way, moving from the South to Michigan, and some of the things that maybe opened his eyes?
Sure. I think one thing I do have to say is that it's come to my understanding, if you spend a long time, over 10 plus years in this, I've come to understand that even the Underground Railroad terminology or language actually came from sports journalists. It's not how my dad, how his teammates, or how Black people or Black players who were part of this kismet that happened, the serendipity and the synchronicity that occurred. And I want to make sure that when we're kind of putting this in its proper context, it's very different than our enslaved ancestors who escaped shackles, to go north and to truly become liberated in that context. And so I have found that some well-meaning sports journalists have used that terminology, and I've even adopted it as I was learning, because if you're learning your own history from sports journalists who've written about this, because the African American men who lived it and some of their white teammates and even Samoan teammates weren't given a platform to tell their story from their perspective, the populace adopts this Underground Railroad language. And now even I, who probably said it and have participated in whatever the narrative was, am taking a step back to really unpack what actually happened. The president at Michigan State University was John Hanna. John Hanna was the chairperson for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So at the same time that he was leading Michigan State University as a university administrator, he was also leading the United States in this conversation around what is happening around our country and what legislation needs to happen so that we can actually see a change occur. So he was doing this work simultaneously. My understanding of history from the oral history, but also John Hanna's memoir and some of the things that were available to me, is they really were doing what they perceived as right, but also recognized that inclusion and being progressive was the direction the country was going, but it was also the direction that sports would need to go if people wanted to continue to be relevant and compete on a national scale. So important legislations happened. Civil Rights Act 1964, Voting Rights Act 1965. My dad becomes a varsity player in 1965. They are named national champions for the first time in 1965, and then again in 1966. So in that context, that we go back and look at this history, it was innovation, it was creativity, but it was also a climate where not only are we going to go and seek out opportunity to recruit people who would benefit from the opportunity of having access to the education, but I also have to say Michigan State University really benefited from recruits like my father, like Jimmy Ray, like Charlie Thornhill, Bubba Smith, George Webster, Ernie Pasteur, and a number of these African American players from the South. And they even went to Hawaii and recruited amazing players that made this team and this era at Michigan State really, really special. And it was a true collaboration. I think the reason I push back on the Underground Railroad is it wasn't sort of what we are accustomed to in the 21st century of these sort of white savior narratives, right? That these were just suffering men who weren't going to accomplish anything, but for the fact that, this opportunity happened. Everybody won in this situation. This was a collaborative effort. The stakes for my dad and his teammates were so high to leave segregation, be in an integrated academic environment, have to navigate, even at that time, redlining was a thing in the state of Michigan and in major cities in Michigan where African Americans had trouble finding housing. And even though John Hanna was there and there were these politicians and others doing very good things, the day-to-day lived reality for African Americans, it wasn't a crystal stair. And so it took true collaboration. My dad couldn't have got there if a coach hadn't recruited him. That coach couldn't have won 2 national titles, or at least earned 2 national titles, if they didn't deliver. They delivered. And this continued to the point where the rest of schools in the South finally kind of got with the program. And you start to see recruitment in places other than the Midwest and out West. And that I think is what is so amazing, and what we stand to learn about this time period. It's something we can't really wrap our heads around, and sometimes find ourselves looking for the easier explanation that, well, white people changed. And the African Americans who were involved in that rose to that challenge. We're prepared. We're ready to achieve at the highest level. And I think that's really the true story.
I'm so sorry. Can I say something, Chad? Really, because you offered me to. So I would say, Maya, one of the most precious things in my possession in my collections that I've been making over the years is signed book. So I have Duffy Dougherty's book. It has his autograph in it. These are rare things. It's hard to find. And I also have Jimmy Ray's book, and Ray of Light, which is fantastic. And he has signed that for me when I interviewed him. And then I also have Denny Green's book. Obviously, he is no longer with us. But when I found it online, it was also signed. But I mentioned Denny Green because it's important to know that Denny Green was Iowa as a player. Denny Green put his career on the line by boycotting in 1967. So while teams are being led by Black players who are winning national championships, essentially, they're still having to fight for these things. And I just think it's so interesting that fight that Denny Green gave, he was definitely a Vikings coach eventually too, but the fight that he gave in boycotting that year could have derailed his chances of being drafted into the NFL. And he did it anyway. And he also went forward and then continued to fight for Black coaches in the NFL. So they really lived this movement. They came of age in the civil rights movement, and you don't see them backing down. When they were called to advocate, they advocated. And for some of them, it put their careers, this was at a time, even in the 90s, when it wasn't popular to talk about race at work. It certainly wasn't popular for your employer to be in the headlines about race. And so they had to be very careful about how they did it, but they did it. And they did it because they knew people had come before them, and they knew that was the traditions they came out of in terms of this community around civil rights. And we have to acknowledge that that's what got us to where we are today.
Really remarkable and amazing stories and amazing explanation. And Maya, one of the things you were saying that I really appreciated is that it's not just about how the story is lived, it's about how the story is told. And I think it's fantastic that both of you are reclaiming ownership of these narratives and telling them in a way that starts to make up for some of these mischaracterizations of, as you said, predominantly white male sports writers that are defining these stories for the world and mischaracterizing them or presenting them through a lens that's not necessarily accurate. The ability for you ladies and others to step in and take back control of that narrative and to tell it in a way that's more authentic is really amazing and powerful. And it's eye-opening to me, and I'm learning a lot just listening intently here today. And one of the things that I've seen and experienced in my life, and that some of these stories you're sharing really echo, is the notion of how sports is so much a microcosm of life and society, and so much of life is played out in the arena. And when you look at the careers and the legacy of your fathers and all these things that were happening contextually within that time, I guess my question is, when you look at that, do you see what was happening in the sports arena as a reflection of changes that were happening through the civil rights movement? Or do you see what was happening in the sports arena setting the tone for what was going on in the rest of society? Or is it a bit of both? Tirana, do you have a perspective on that?
I think that sports leads. I think that's why I'm so dug in and so passionate about this, because it's something everybody can understand. And I think, when you're talking about what your dad was doing in the 1960s, University of Georgia did not integrate its football team until 1970. To put that in perspective, I'm going to tell my age, that's 6 years. That's just 6 years before I was born. So inevitably, and I think for good reason, our humanness wants to see the best product on the field. And I think that sports, that's the beauty of diversity. What people keep saying is it's best for business. It's best for all of us. It produces the best product. And so I think sports led, quite frankly, because it takes individuals to make change. And because these individuals were so excellent and undeniable at what they did, they had to make room for them. And so that's why I think it's a great question, Chad. I've asked myself about this a lot. That's why I think I'm so passionate about it, the power of sports to change society.
And Maya, I see you nodding a lot as Tirana's talking. You had a brilliant narrative that you provided in your book that really educated me about the history of desegregation of college athletics, and particularly the Big Ten Athletic Conference. And you talked about the leadership role that John Hanna and others took in that process. As you're nodding, you must be agreeing very much with Tirana's statement that sports leads and takes the lead in these cultural changes.
Absolutely. I think, my initial response was going to be, I think it's both, but I agree with everything Tirana has said. So I wouldn't contradict that. But I also know that from the perspective of legislation, if we didn't have a Brown versus Board of Education and we didn't have sort of an end to segregation in public spaces, whether the South decided they were going to actually proceed with change, they didn't. I think in my book, I call it with all obstinate speed. They moved towards an integrated society, but I think it goes hand in hand. And I think certainly with women in sports, with Title IX, if there wasn't those concrete decisions from a legislative standpoint and an agreement in our culture that says women should have the same access to resources that our young men have, that people with disabilities, like when you look at all of the social movement in terms of inclusion, in terms of saying all human beings have human rights and should be given the same access to what the community has. If you don't have the support of legislation, you can have pockets of people who agree with cultural change, and you can have our outliers and our Jackie Robinsons and the heroes that we look to. But throughout all of that time before we actually saw concrete legislative change, those kinds of stories were lone integrator stories. They were outliers. They were people who had these horrible, stories that they had to persevere through. But I think to Tirana's point, sport leads. So if you are the one lone integrator and you're amazing, people are going to come near and far to come see you play. And that's going to raise more tickets in that climate. And I'm thinking in the 50s, it wasn't the big dollars that it is now, but yeah, there's a benefit. If you can sell more tickets, you can get more views, more eyeballs watching things on a national scale. And for my dad and his teammates, this was around the time that college football was nationally televised. So some of my favorite footage of that era is seeing brown skin poking through the uniforms and through the guard grid of the helmets, to be like, you can't get away from that. If you are watching Michigan State and Notre Dame in the game of the century in 1966, the camera's close enough that you can tell that team looks a little different than what you're used to seeing elsewhere that football is being televised. So I definitely think sports lead, but those little shifts, it helps when there's laws that say you can't discriminate against people. Then there's laws that say you have to give people a chance.
Yeah, I think the way I would sum it up is sports definitely leads, but you can't take the lead if you can't even get on the field. So the climate and the environment and the law had to make it the opportunity available. And then once these amazing players were given the opportunity, they seized it and did everything they possibly could with it on the field, and then also making cultural change as a result.
Yeah, it's a stage. It's the stage for change, because clearly a piece of legislation is not sexy, but seeing it on the field, that's pretty amazing. And that game that you're talking about was broadcast on ABC, was the first time, I'm quite sure, that America saw a Black man lead a football team. On the flip side, one of the first college football's games broadcast by ABC was a segregated team, was Alabama. So the media can be used, and I'm passionate about this as a member of the media, to reinforce narratives or create new ones. And I think that's why the work that Maya is doing is so important, is to bring new narratives to the fore.
Yeah. Very, very amazing stuff. And, I think further about the Dadage, which is the basis for this series that we're doing right now, in the Dadages, a commitment to diversity opens many doors, sometimes doors you didn't even know were closed. And as I listened to some of these impact stories and how so much was being changed by these players on the field, I take a step back and I listen, though, to the stories of your fathers, and that they were, living their lives. They were pursuing their dreams, and they may not have even known at the time that they were making history. Do you both think that there was a moment along the way for your fathers where they actually had a realization, and when the two of you had a realization of the impact that they were having on changing the face of sports and changing the minds of the world? Dadages friends and family, you'll have to wait until next time to hear the answer from Tirana and Maya. You won't want to miss the second half of this interview as we learn more about Tirana and Maya discovering history in their own households. And I talk about how both of these amazing women are now making history themselves. Until then, remember, Dad may not always know what he's talking about, but he sure can sound like he does.